Guests who have, let's start with those who have come from overseas. Sean Clark, who is invisible here, but he sits there in the iPad. He's connected with his computer in London, and I'm sure he's awake now. Hello, London! Hi, Sean! I'm sure he is connected with us. Second from the UK is Mike Stubbs. Mike Stubbs is actually a known person here in Australia because he lived here for a while. And we had quite a bit to do with each other when you were living here. He was the director of ACME for a while as well. And presently he's the director of FACT, which means?
The Foundation for Art and Creative Technology.
Right, in Liverpool in the UK, which is similar for those, perhaps you know the ZKM in Karlsruhe. It's a little bit similar to that. Because,
something like this.
Next
Maybe
in
more
line, here we got Ross Harley. Ross Harley is presently the director of COFA, the College of Fine Arts of New South Wales, University of New South Wales, and the co-chair of ISEA this year. ISEA is an international conference on digital art, which happens to be here this year. Last but not least, I start with the Sydney Sider, and I start with a real Sydney Sider, which is Josh. Josh Harle just was a PhD candidate. He written his PhD at COFA as well. Josh is the artist, it's the other iPad that is communicating with Sean Clark and with Ernest's work over there. It's a very complicated work. It's fantastically simple, but technically very complicated in my world. And then last but not very, very least, the one who initiated it all, my lovely artist, Ernest. Ernest Edmonds is a professor at the UTS here for digital art and at the Goldsmith College in London, and there's another call that has come up.
De Montfort University. De Montfort University.
That's the one, that's it. So we talked about this exhibition a while ago, which is based, of course, on digital art, and we're having a conversation about light logic. I don't know if you understand what that means. If you don't, please ask questions. And we're talking about the future of digital art. And I'll pass on to Ernest, who is leading the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Two quick things I want to say. First of all, light logic. Where does that come from? Well, light, because the whole exhibition is about light, reflected light, transmitted light, and in effect light across the waves of the internet. Logic, because in this time, when this exhibition was thought of last year, was the 100th birthday of Alan Turing. Alan Turing was a logician without whose work we would never have had computers. Logic made computers possible, made digital art possible, made this possible. So logic is behind it all. I wanted to just say thank you to Connie for putting on the show and this evening, and thank everyone here for coming. Thank you, my colleagues, for joining us here. And a few more thanks, really, for people who've helped me. Damien, who's here somewhere.
Yeah,
Thank
Damien.
you very much. And I should also say thanks to the University of Technology in Sydney, who've been very, very supportive. I'm employed there in the School of Software, which is very relevant to this exhibition. It's software art, much of it. The School of Software in the Faculty of Engineering and IT. It's very interesting that the Faculty of Engineering and IT and the School of Software have been so supportive of art. Okay, and I think that's a very positive thing that I want to say thank you to UTS for that. And okay, and that's all I wanted to say really, and I think we want to now have a conversation, and I'd like to ask Mike to start the conversation.
Firstly, can I just say that there are a number of people in this room who I've known for many, many years, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all, because in a sense there are a lot of people in this room that have been driven by a similar agenda to Ernest over a long period of time, and I want to speak about that this evening. I'm going to try and provide a bit of context as to why this exhibition is significant, and to try and explain why I'm a backer of Ernest's practice. So in 2005 I curated an exhibition at ACME called White Noise, and all the works had some digital or moving image component, but none of those works were non-representational. There was no narrative, there was no picture of something. And that was really compelling. And my starting point for that exhibition was actually Malevich, the constructivist abstract artist, who of course wanted to confound people. He was unhappy and unsettled by the social, political environment of that time. And that's worth bearing in mind when people reject sort of popular, common forms of expression. We have to ask why they do that. So, although often we're confounded, it's quite contradictory to our nature to look at things which are both formal and minimal, there's always some kind of reason for that in the first place. The next thing I wanted to say, because I'm going to try and be brief, is that I was very privileged in 2011 to work with the Kunstpalas Düsseldorf and the Tate Liverpool with FACT to curate a major retrospective of the work of Nam June Paik. Now, within media art and new media circles, many people think of Nam June Paik as the kind of originator of a new media practice, but I don't think of him like that. I think of him as an artist, as a provocateur, who happened to understand the potentiality of technology and media, and more importantly, what that might lead to in terms of creating change. And of course, he was also a member of Fluxus, along with Yoko Ono, who was John Lennon's partner. And I live in Liverpool, the home of the Beatles, and people hate Yoko Ono, because she's actually, she's basically perceived to be the person that took their darling, their son of Liverpool, away from Liverpool. But so we think about Fluxus, and we think about the contemporary art world, post-Dadaism, post-constructivism, and that art and technology is part of that contemporary history, and that Ernest's practice is part of that history. This is not a flash in the pan. A few of us will have enjoyed Vivid. A number of us will have seen the exhibitions within the context of ISEA, where we're looking for that surface stimulation. Those of us with children or grandchildren know the speed at which people expect things to happen and change. But what Ernest has really done over a lifetime, this is not just any old exhibition. This is actually the coming together of a series of works and practices which haven't really steered far off a central course, which for me is significant in that focus, and sort of explores a very tight set of constraints. So we're looking at subtle differences, and we're looking at we're looking through Ernest's lens at change, but over a period of time, not instantaneous. So that I think when you first see one of these interactive works, we'll call them interactive because unlike the paintings or the painting prints, they do actually change if you spend some time with them. And of course, the painting prints also change over time too. You need to spend a lot longer, because then you'll see the degradation of colour as the light changes the material. But the electronic works, or the ones which use computational physics, are actually changeable, and there's an interaction there which is more overt, but nothing like as overt as some of the other works that we'll see within this current context. So I'm kind of just going to wrap up my pitch, and I think I've pretty much said everything I want to. Thank you for inviting me.
Ross, do you want to contribute to the discussion?
Absolutely. So look, it's great to be seeing the works that Ernest has assembled, particularly downstairs. I wanted to just start by thinking about this idea of light, logic, and I think, as Mike has reminded us, Ernest has a very long and deep practice. Often when we think about electronic art, we tend to forget that people like Ernest and many others have been working in this field for many, many years, sometimes decades. on the same trajectory to think about the quality of light, to think about the quality of colour, but also to think about the way in which that will change in different circumstances, the way in which colour and light will change in different media. And so I think Ernest's work reminds us of continuity and change at the same time. And when Ernest asked me to come and be part of this conversation, I was intrigued by the fact that a solo artist in a commercial gallery like Connie's would invite two collaborators, two people to come and collaborate or to show with him upstairs. And the work that we see upstairs is actually really pretty fascinating. As Mike suggested, it changes very slowly. And the nature of the interaction is actually, it's quite difficult to penetrate the logic. So the logic behind the works that we see, especially this beautiful piece projected behind us, is actually connected to these two other works which are on the tablets that stand before the projection piece. And what's going on between those three works is a dialogue in protocol, a dialogue in rules, and a dialogue across a network. So just a very quick technical explanation of what's going on in layperson's terms. Each of these works is connected to the internet, and as somebody interacts with one by swiping or touching or choosing a colour, you'll notice the changes that might happen on the tablet that you're interacting with. But that then sends that data to a server, which then changes what happens on the other works as well. And so over time, the colour, the form, the composition of the big projection and of the smaller tablets change. And it's a logic which is a network logic, and it's a logic that isn't direct or continuous. So many interactive works, you sort of have to figure out what's going on, and people walk into a space and they wave around or they jump up and down to see what's going on. These works are nothing like that. The interaction is between a more contemplative audience, somebody who goes and engages in aesthetic relationship to the work, makes some choices, which then, as we've just seen 2 seconds ago, over time changes what happens in the other works. So I suppose I wanted to hand the baton over to Josh to get him to tell us a little bit about how that worked for him. So Josh was invited by Ernest to bring his work into this context.
No, by me.
Oh, by Connie, sorry.
I actually introduced it to us that Ernest, would you give us permission to include a young artist? So we have different generations as well. And I think that
younger than Mike and myself.
So that I thought that was very generous of you, Ernest, that you gave that permission, which was actually, really, that whole thing came together within the last 3 weeks, and I think that is I think that's the logic of art, if I may add that.
Oh, that's tricky. So
jump into the logic.
Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I feel honoured to be pulled into this amazing show. It was pretty much, so well established and such great work, and then I managed to get in on the side and get the benefit of being associated with it. What I really love about the way in which these works are interacting with each other is that it's a really straightforward, like if you're talking about the logic of interaction of these devices, it's such a straightforward protocol of communication that goes on between the works, and then what you get at is this emergent behavior, which is really something special. And I think, I've just finished 4 years of art research with the crossover between science and computer science and all these sort of things.
We call it a PhD. Josh has just submitted his PhD, so.
Absolutely. So I mean, that's what excites me is this emergent sort of non-linear generative thing that you get out of it. And this is a really perfect example of it, where these works are really just, each one standalone is a good work, and then when you put them together you just get something that's really unknown and just pushes into very different sort of territory. So
Would you say like complexity from simple things?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very basic rule set that just that like a fractal sort of effect that you get out of it.
I've just come from an opening where Josh has another show, blatant advertisement for a show at Kudos, which is just up the road. And Josh has a show which is, well, he's in a show which has a work which is very similar, but quite different. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the similarities and the differences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that work is just the work standalone. So it's presenting itself just in its own context. And you do get something, curating Volker pulling that show together, you get some of the same effect when you have different artists and a curator will pull them together in a theme, and that will produce new connections between works that you hadn't thought of before. So that emergent relationship is still there very much in the act of curating. But my work technically is just sort of sitting there, you interact with it, and you move around, and there's nothing beyond just the boundary of the work itself. But I was really excited about seeing this work working with the others, interacting with the others, and just like the magic of it is that I don't know what will come out of it, basically. You throw them together and it's an experiment and something really amazing can come out of it. I can't say, having done the low level, you program these little bits to say, I'm going to send out data here and I'm going to receive data here. You don't know until you run it through what's going to come out of it.
I maybe should say on Sean Clark's behalf, as he isn't here, I'll be Sean Clark for a minute. Sean is also just about, he hasn't actually submitted his PhD, but he's actually working with me for a PhD in England, a similar sort of process that Josh has been through. And he's very interested, his PhD is about systems, and so I've been working with him on this notion of what does it mean to use systems in art. And we've come to this notion of looking at it as a bigger and bigger picture of what a system really is. And what we see here, and what I've been working with Sean and Josh for this about, is to use that notion of systems in a way, and that Sean has set up. He's set up this protocol for his work to work with mine, and because he did that, and he did it so simply, the protocol that Sean set up, we could just hand to Josh, who of course is technically expert, but nevertheless could very quickly make use of that protocol and make his new work, adapt his work to work with it. So, and I think that aspect is something that Sean is very keen on, that it's simple. And it's this notion of simple things leading to complex behaviours.
I suppose I'm also interested in how does protocol work in the art world, how do formal rules, which seem to be the absolute antithesis of creativity expression, how does that work for you?
Well, it seemed to be fundamental because, I mean, I like Canaletto, and you wouldn't have Canaletto without perspective, which is pretty serious geometry, pretty serious rules about perspective. I like Bach. You wouldn't have Bach without pretty serious rules of fugue and so on and so forth. And in fact, I think, so in fact, I believe this. Let's put it from another point of view. In being creative, it is necessary to constrain the space of creative thought. And in fact, I can say that I know of research of designers working, and what the research shows is if you give designers too open a brief, the first thing they do is add constraints to it, to limit the space. Okay. So the rules are actually an important part of the creative process. And that may be to do with mental limitations of the human brain or something, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist. But it does seem to be the case that limiting the capability, limiting the possibilities is an important inspiration for creativity. And I think you see it in art all over the place, as I say, from perspective to the fugue, to serial music, to whatever. And the whole notion that you can simply have have a blank canvas, some pots of paint, and just kind of dream and make a good painting is not really much respected by any artist that I know. You know, so it's the opposite of the false model of Van Gogh that many people have. Van Gogh, of course, is a much better artist than people realise. So to me, actually, there are two things in a sense. One is then that the rules and formal structures are very important, I believe, to the creative process. But also I think that they're important to perception and to our experience as the receiver or the audience or the participant in an artwork as well. Because when we listen to a piece of music, or we look at a painting, or we get involved in an interactive work, we're looking for shape and form in some way. And I believe that the structures which we may not be able to unpick, nevertheless structure something that can resonate with our perception and our cognition. So.
Can I ask a question? Can the audience participate?
Yeah, I think so. It's a conversation, so that's the idea.
Ernest, just you touched on shape and form, and one of my favorite series of your work is the Shape and Form works, the small work in the corner that has a camera that changes and grows. I wondered if you might talk a little bit about your generative process.
Okay, so briefly, a lot of my time-based work is generative. That's to say, there are rules that imply what might happen, and a computer program actually makes that happen. And the rules cover what the hue should be, what the saturation of the colour should be, what the shape should be, and so on and so forth, and also what the time sequences should be, as in music and so on and so forth. And basically, a generative work, and most computer-based software art is generative, not just mine. I mean, it's very generally the case, where in the software there are some rules are embodied, and those rules imply the work. And the interesting thing about that compared to like a movie is a movie has a beginning and an end, and a generative work can be infinite, and can change forever. And then the other thing, the final thing to mention, that to answer your question, is that in those works with the Shape and Form, there's a camera. In some works I use a microphone, doesn't matter. They're taking data from the world outside, and that data is being analysed by the computer as it's doing this stuff, and that is being used to change the rules. So the rules are evolving over time, and that's like, metaphorically you might say, it's like life, you know, like we interact with the world and we change because we interact with the world. What we do is different because of this interaction, and the work is like that.
Thank you.
Ernest, we were talking a little earlier about you know, that difference in, you know, when you're making a painting, you know, you've got that control over exactly your outcome or that output, and that you know, when you've kind of moved into that digital space. I mean, just in that description, you were talking about something that you know, feels like very much you kind of release it and you let it go.
Yep.
And then we were talking about with the screen works how, you know, that's that kind of or the digital works, how, you know, the interface really affects, you know, the screen that you've got the work on. So how do you kind of negotiate those two different kind of medium spaces, given your sense of control?
Yeah, you know, I'm not a control freak really, but but every artist, all art, doesn't matter what kind of art you do, everything matters. So unlike in like mathematics, where you can not worry about what font is used and so on, sort of thing, you know, the colour of the paper doesn't matter in mathematics and so on and so forth. In art, everything matters. There's nothing that doesn't matter. That's one of the kind of things. So that what we were talking about earlier is that's a problem. For example, if you can't control the colour settings on the screen. Okay. So it's a challenge. You know, how do you handle that? How do you handle the fact that there's a whole range of possibilities? Maybe I can answer the question. And so let's just say that is a problem, and I do it mostly by providing the screen is part of the work, so I actually control it. Although I'm experimenting with making these works that just go on a television, and that's worrying because you've not got enough control. But the interesting point maybe goes back to this generative thing, because in making generative work, what you do, you're kind of lifting the level of concern in the art. So you're designing the structure, and you're designing what might relate to what, and so on and so forth. but you actually don't know what that work might look like in 6 months' time at a particular moment. So that's kind of interesting. It's kind of like dangerous, but it's a nice danger, if you see what I mean. It's an enjoyable sort of risk thing. And what you're trying to do is to construct structures that always work, in a sense. And that's the challenge. Maybe it's impossible, but it's like something to try to do. Josh will probably say something.
I had a conversation about the imminent accident today, and I imagine that in 7 months, without any interaction, there'll be an error message, or the thing will be completely stopped, which is interesting. And it's not just a joke to make. It's like an interesting fact of technology that's something that's going to come out of it. But,
I'd just like to kind of throw in, as someone who is trained as a filmmaker, actually on celluloid and then worked in video, that there was this whole kind of thing about broadcast standard. And there was a point within media where you could regulate what the black level should be, what the conditions the monitor should be. And of course now we're in a very different scenario where people don't care. And that in terms of, if you think about the invention of what was called hi-fi, or stereophonic audio, I guess in that was popularised in the early 1970s, that now, apart from when people will go to a cinema where they can see a film properly, they will watch it on any device. Not necessarily in the correct aspect ratio in which it was intended. You just, and I do it too. I'm just a person. So it's really very interesting in terms of how, in certain kind of vernacular conditions, we will accept content in any form or other. That's largely because we're still dependent on the narrative. But when we've actually got something which is kind of reduced down to these levels, that actually becomes much more critical. But we might also relate that back to Renaissance painting in terms of what the correct angle of light might be to look at a painting. So yeah, it's an interesting consideration.
But these sort of questions are a challenge, you know, and life isn't contained and simple and solved. Sorry.
I'm reminded of some experiments, I can't remember who did them, where they were testing whether people can predict the sequence of a random series of colours, red and green, and people would get it worse than chance. And so people are inferior to mice in that regard. And at the end, the researchers would say that was actually random, and the subject of the experiment would say, no, you're wrong. There was a pattern. Just didn't get it right all the time. And this, and forgive me, I don't wish to sound facetious, but this feels like that's turning that idea on its head, that it's creating, there's a logic underlying, there's a generative kind of phenomena, but the perception of that is quite opaque. That is, you have to spend a long time to understand what is happening. And I guess my question is, what do you as artists expect of your audience? What do you want them to experience? Or is that even a valid question?
Oh yes, it is very.
I think that's a fantastic question, because it's often really tempting to try and. We had a conversation, Ernest and I, about whether it would be obvious from the way that the works were interacting exactly what the interaction would be. And Ernest rightly pointed out that it's, you're not trying to provide something which is like a mystery that needs to be solved, and that. Yeah, it's really interesting how much you're giving and what you're trying to get out of this generative behavior. I think in that example of the psychology experiment where the person insists that there is a pattern, I don't think it's necessarily true that the psychologists are right that it's random, because in an arbitrary set there could be a pattern. There's always a pattern. This is one of my favorite mathematics, I'm going just way mathematical geekery as far out as possible. My favorite sort of hippie-esque mathematical algorithm is the Fourier transform, where you can take an arbitrary signal and reduce it down to a set of sine waves of different amplitudes and frequencies that when they're overlaid into each other will create that starting signal. And for me, that's like, you know, it's vibrations of the world sort of thing. You could say the same thing about this set of, and it, you know, I'm sure a computational scientist will be the first person to admit that when you talk about a random signal, you're talking about pseudo-random. It's very, very difficult to get a random signal. So, you know, you take that 20 different color sets, and you could come up with maybe 100 fairly straightforward ways in which there is an underlying pattern to those. I just went off into an amazing spiritual journey to answer your question, but yeah, yeah, it's a problem. How much you give, like not trying to give the game away. I mean, I still get a little bit of a conflict with myself about what you're giving the audience. Which I think they should probably err on the side of the mystery, and because there's fantastic things of emotional investment in the mystery, but I think maybe someone else.
I have a part B to that question, which is,
yeah.
What do you understand about the work? Because you don't predict, you can't predict
Yeah.
what it's going to be like.
Well,
how do you feel about it?
I was really excited about this because I didn't know, for one thing, when I was testing it, one of the works wasn't on, and this was the work that was doing the majority of the behavioral sort of stuff. So when I was testing it, it was basically mind bouncing off of itself. It was sending data off into ColorNet, and then Sean's work, without me interacting with it, was just sort of sitting there fairly passive. When people are interacting with it, it works a little bit differently. But the main sort of color shaping algorithm wasn't actually running. So I didn't know when I put it in this context with everything on what it would turn out to be, and it's really exciting to see what it does.
So, first of all, the quick thing, support of what you're saying is that, of course, as you know perfectly well, pseudo-random numbers are not random, and probably that's what the psychologists were using. But they may not have realised that pseudo-random numbers weren't random. But what do I expect? To go back to your first question, what do I expect? Well, I hope that people will look. Okay? And what I notice is that it's very hard. People find it very hard to look or listen. Okay? Gestalt psychology teaches you that what people really do is they impose patterns that are known to them on what is in front of them, and they don't actually look. You know, so they see a picture of a Gainsborough or something on the wall, and they see the countryside, and they don't think about the kind of the paint and And one of the hardest things to do is look or listen. It's the same with music. And one of the things that I think I expect is that I do things that kind of encourage, or maybe I should say almost force, or kind of challenge people to look. Okay? It's not about interpretation, it's about looking for the visual aspect.
And the other thing I was going to say, I've been looking at Ernest's work for the last 15 minutes that we've been talking, and there's nothing random about it at all, in a sense. Although I can't predict what colours, what form will appear, I know that the rules are actually, they're pretty restricted, so it's a very restricted palette of colours and of geometry. So basically, it's horizontal lines, there are 4 spaces mostly, and they'll randomly change, but that's part of the pleasure of the work. I wonder, is that how you have coded it? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, except that there's nothing random. Well, no, this isn't true. Sorry, I take that back. There's nothing random with. Okay, it's determinate. The software is deterministic.
Yeah.
So if there's no interaction with these other works or anything else, it still does stuff, and it's completely deterministic. But it's an open system, which means it communicates with the outside world, with these other works. There's a camera that looks at stuff and whatever. And so there are things that happen from the outside world that change it.
And I would like to take it a notch further.
Yeah.
Because you could ask the question, why am I actually showing such art?
Yeah.
Because
Connie, why are you actually showing such art?
this is where hard logic comes in. Yeah. I would like people to feel art. And when you start to sit down and look at the art, or you listen and you look at the interactivity, particularly of this installation up here, you have the exchange of 3 artists, including yourself. So the 4th person, which is you as the visitor, as the participant, you become the 4th aspect, another network connection amongst the 3. And if someone else is standing by and watches what you do, it's a kind of imaginary cell effect. You know what I mean with that? It's not real, but it is definitely real. You get what I mean? I don't know if you do.
It doesn't sound real, but it sounds imaginary real.
But maybe
it has an effect in you.
Yeah.
And that's what I would like. And I love that when you suggested yesterday, Ernest, to put those little chairs downstairs so people actually can sit. And you said meditate. I wouldn't even see it like this. But it is the observation of the artwork, and then the next observation, what does it do to me? And how do I interact again with the artwork on top of it? So you actually become an observer of an unlimited space.
I can add to that. The reason I suggested this was to do with an evaluation we did of such work that Linda will be talking about at ISEA. So there's another connection.
In the morning.
In the morning.
9 o'clock sharp.
9 o'clock in the morning.
Please be there.
Tomorrow, where people were, there were structured interviews with people. I wasn't involved in this evaluation, but I'm a recipient of the results. People were asked various things about how their experience of this exhibition in England, which included some of these same works. And what was striking was how in many cases there was a reference to something like meditation, altar, these kinds of words were used by people who were having this kind of spiritual experience somehow. Not in any logic, not in any way you could say what it was that did it, but somehow they did it. And the fact that there were not chairs there, but several people went to the staff of the gallery and asked for chairs. Could I have a chair? And then sat there for a quarter of an hour looking at it. So that was interesting, that that kind of experience that Connie is after in showing, we found out by these interviews was happening as well.
Someone with a hand up, right out in the back.
In his book on chaos theory, James Blake articulates a new understanding of chaos not as pure randomness, but as ordered randomness. In other words, as I defined it in an article, the predictability of unpredictability, and at the same time, the unpredictability of predictability. It seems to me you're operating in the same domain.
Exactly so. Yeah, that's exactly so. Exactly right.
That was very predictable, Alan.
No, but that's on the nail.
And yet very unpredictable at the same time.
That's on the bump.
Yes, please.
I'm wondering, Ernest, what happens when you turn off the system? Does it memorize everything, the interactions it had before, and when you next turn on, does it start from scratch, or does it remember?
There's a hard disk. It keeps a record on the hard disk.
Oh, it does?
Yeah.
Okay. So it and then it
if you switch it on, it goes and looks at what was last there when you switched it off.
So would our value systems change about according to history of an object? So this artwork has attended to New York and Hong Kong, and Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman interacted with them. So it's quite interesting artwork compared to the others. So 10 years later, would it be possible that this artwork is, because of that history, it becomes valuable?
Yes.
Well, we did that.
We did that.
We did
In fact,
that.
exactly.
Tom and Nicole, really?
No. We did that. That was a conversation between Sydney and Glasgow.
Belfast.
Right? Belfast. Yeah. Oh my God. Different.
But yeah, so the work is actually shaped. That's where the shaping comes in. It's actually shaped by its experience, you might say. And so therefore, you might, depending how you feel about these people who are interacting with it, Nicole Kidman interacted with it, maybe you like it better or whatever, but the work having a different experience will lead to subtle but different direction.
It also raises the whole question around duration and permanence.
Yes.
Because clearly, if there's Gem Finer's 1,000-year long-playing record project. So the idea of actually making an artwork that can exist into infinity, and of course if you're working in stone or bronze, there's an assumption that that might last a really long time. Largely people are working with sort of technology or electronic materials. There's a major debate around how much you can archive, how you archive. I don't know how long is your show going to run? 6, 8 weeks, 10 weeks?
4 weeks.
4 weeks, okay. So that's, you know, if this was in place over 100 years, we'd see a different set of changes, and it would also have different cultural memory. And that also, you can start to think about that in relationship to Vivid, because obviously, like Vivid was a fantastic success for the city of Sydney, but it was on for 3 days, and people walked past it for, they might have witnessed something for 5 minutes and not really observed anything other than the most immediate change. However, if that was going over a period of time and the architecture is then embedded with some of these technologies, we're moving into another domain. The fact that Connie's been brave to show this work, because this is not, you know, in terms of running a commercial art gallery, which I understand you to be doing, this isn't automatically easily saleable work. Some of it's got difficulty to it, especially if it's got an element of technology to it. So we should applaud her for that as well. So what can you do? So there's that thing about the institution actually having to think about new time frames, and also when we think about asking the artist of what do they want the audience to think. As someone who comes from a cultural institution where I've actually got a contract with the government to provide most of my funding with the UK government, I have to provide a certain number of people with an experience, and I have to be able to prove that both intrinsically it was of value and also that the people really came and they were affected by it. The work that I'm really attracted to is normally difficult, either politically difficult, socially difficult, or formally difficult. And all the time I am in the negotiation with the artist or the group, because I'm also working with collaborations, of how we can sort of push those boundaries. And we're also expecting, not just us lot, you know, it's like, it's great you've all turned up because you think it's great art, or you've come to support Ernest or the other artists and us. But in terms of the general public, you know, what strategies have we got to make sure that they look at work which is as difficult as this too? And I think that actually comes down to the personal. I think that it's our own individual responsibility to be able to kind of tell the story as to why I might find this work of value. Because no one else is really marketing it.
Well, on top of it, we're in Australia. We're very far from the rest of the world, and may I say that in Europe and in America, this kind of art has a big history. I just would like to remind of Manfred Moore, who I actually initially invited to a show with Ernest, because it's also a mutual friend of Ernest. But he has so many obligations this year because they're celebrating his 60th. I think it's 60 or 70? 70, I'm sure it is 70.
Beyond 70 now.
And Manfred, he's German, but he lives nowadays in New York, but he travels constantly around the world. He is one of the first computer animation pioneers who did all this in the 50s. Can you imagine? 1950, he came up with that. That was... you know, I mean, Pike was even before that. No, well, around the same time. So there were a few pioneers around that, but Manfred is again very concrete, which goes under the category of concrete art and conceptual art, like Ernest. And his patterns, the software that he creates, that is what I would like to add what you were saying before. That has no limits to it. Some of his works continuously until the end of the day will create new patterns that were never there before. So each time you look at the screen, it's a different pattern that you can rest assured it's never the same. So that is quite sensational. And I really feel ashamed that we couldn't get even one work, but all of his works are needed for the big exhibition at the ZKM. a huge retrospective and anniversary show. But please do look up, for those who don't know, Manfred Moore. You will find out what I'm talking. It's a very, very interesting piece of work, and it goes back to the 50s. So that's quite amazing.
Yeah.
So in terms of selling, yes, the works are for sale. And I think that was very kind of you, Ernest, that you actually entered some paintings this time. And I think the paintings bring this, they actually bring a very limited and, yeah, a limited perspective into it that actually is also in the unlimited work. That's something you were saying. There is a limitation to some work, unless you record it so intensely in your mind that you would recognize it or realize it again. But that is certainly not the case. Our brains don't function like that. So in a way, you've got the constantly changing new artwork every minute, which is of course very pleasing to our present day and age to have something new all the time. But at the same time, what feeling, what experience do you get out of it? What is programmed inside yourself when you see that? And I think the work that you did on TV is something very contemporary and very cutting edge, because this is actually an artwork which is also ever changing, but you can install that on your TV with a computer, and if you have guests, you can actually, instead of having a stupid TV sitting there, you don't even have to hide it. You can actually put an artwork on it, and it is quite reasonable. But I think what the work that I'm doing, and I've been doing this since I've arrived in Australia, I do educate the Australian art scene. I'm not a commercial gallery as such that I'm doing exhibitions to please my audience. I'm an educator. I am wanting to show people interesting art, cutting edge international art. So you find, can I say that? You find yourself through art. And that is the heart logic perhaps, or the spiritual in the art, in every piece of art. It all comes from some kind of mind and from some heart energy that drives the artist to do it. Otherwise, why are you in these jobs that, that could, if you would be in a different job, you would most probably earn a lot more money. But your heart drives you to do that. So there is something that is your energy, your flow that you really want to do. And that's again talking to the same people who would like to enjoy that. So please spread the word that we do have that here, and enjoy it, keep coming, and educate yourself and get to know yourself through the artwork, because it's something we don't see very often in Australia. And it connects us with the world as well. And I love to connect everyone. I love to connect with international points. So we are at the pulse of time, at the zeitgeist, and we're connected to where it's at the moment. We don't want to be yesterday, and we don't want to be in the future, but we want to be in the avant-gardistic idea of catching the moment that is happening before the rest of the world is realizing it. And that's what we're doing here, right?
Thank you very much, Connie.
So I thank everyone for your incredible contribution and for your patience, and you're very welcome to go downstairs and have a glass of drink. And for those who haven't been on our database, please tell Catherine your details and you're on our database.
When you know how we